as we move through physical and digital space, and that is increasingly captured, we need to look at these as extensions of ourself that belong to us in the way that you might think that your soul belongs to you. Today I want to talk about the idea of a data soul. And I know that language is a little more spiritual than the language that I usually use, but I have a good reason for it, and I think it's actually quite appropriate. I think that reason will be increasingly clear as we go through this topic and step through the history of both the concept from my perspective as well as the actual language and etymology of this word soul, and what it means and how we conceptualize it and how we have conceptualized it in the past, and also how we are increasingly changing our relationship to that concept. Now, I first discussed the concepts that gave rise to this idea in an essay that I wrote on Medium by the name of Data Slavery and Decentralized Emancipation. And in that essay, I was talking about many of the dangers that we face as a society by allowing our data, allowing all the fragments of the data that is generated when we come into contact in both digital context and increasingly in the real world with pieces of technology that are capable of measuring, recording, and storing data about our individual behavior in ways that actually don't belong to us. So these pieces of data, these fragments of data, these measurements effectively of us as human beings and our behavior are stored on someone else's servers and someone else's server farms. Technically, this is the property of someone else. It is not the property of you, despite the fact that it is a measurement of you or about you. And I was talking about the way that the consequences of scaling that pattern up. So scaling the current legal frameworks we have around data ownership, scaling the idea that we actually don't own all data that is based on measurement of us. What happens when you scale that up? And I made the assertion that, I actually don't think we can avoid an extremely tyrannical and authoritarian manner of government control, or I actually don't think democracy is sustainable if we do not make the conscious choice and take action to protect and change the laws such that we actually own our own data. And not just change the laws, because I actually don't necessarily think that the legal infrastructure is the most effective means by which we are capable of catalyzing this transformation. I actually think that it is far more pragmatic and far more, it holds far more potential for success if we are to actually create technologies that by default require anyone who wishes to make a measurement of you as a human being or store data about you as a human being to cryptographically encode that request in a ledger or whatever the evolved technology may be in the future with respect to transparently understanding who has requested your data. And in that sense, you are capable of actually having a much more granular understanding of all the ways in which the entities, the economic entities out there in, on both digital and physical space are capturing your data, tracing you, understanding and modeling you as a virtual entity. And that is the reality of this, is that you are being modeled as a virtual simulation. And that simulation is being used to predict your behavior. And those predictions about your behavior are being used to nudge you into particular choices, whether those choices are in the political realm, whether they're in the economic domain, whether it's trying to get you to make a particular vote or vote a particular way, or whether, as we saw with Cambridge Analytica, or whether it's trying to get you to purchase a specific good, as we all, either consciously or unconsciously experience every time we visit an e-commerce website. The point is that fundamentally all of these sites, especially the larger tech entities that have extremely robust capacities to track and trace your data and generate extremely large profiles, about you that are increasingly equivalent to the real you in terms of the decision models that you might make. But basically, the fact is that what's happening is you are being recreated virtually, and that recreation of you, the virtual self, is being stored on infrastructure that you don't own and being used in ways that you have no say over. And personally, I don't think this is sustainable, nor do I think it is ethical. I think more people need to truly internalize what this means. And that's where the idea of a data soul comes in. Because I think that not only is the phrase compelling, it resonates quite deeply, and it basically piggybacks on a commensurate idea historically, but it also is actually true in a very deep sense. And now I think we should probably explore that sense. So I didn't actually know this when I first used this term data soul. I think the first time that I used the term was during the interview that I had with Benjamin Boyce on unbreaking the internet. And I'll link to that, and I'll also link to the essay that I mentioned below. So if you want to actually do that research and watch either that interview or read the essay that I wrote on this topic, you can do that. And I would recommend that you actually do that. But in that talk, I used this term for the first time. I kind of framed it as a data soul. And that's as opposed to the idea of a data wake, which is the term that I use in the essay that I wrote. And it's interesting to me because when I wrote the essay and tried to frame this idea as a data wake, so you can imagine yourself as kind of a sovereign ship of self moving through, moving through the seas of the broader internet of the world at large, and the wake behind you, the effects that you have on everything in the system through which you move. That's your wake, that's your data wake. And so there was this metaphor that I had been using that was deeply related to moving through water, moving through the sea, and people actually being able to, especially these large technology firms, being able to understand and capture pieces of that wake and then remodel or basically use that to recreate a virtual variant of yourself, a behavioral model, a behavioral simulation of who you are. And what I didn't know, before I actually looked this up, before I looked at the etymology or the history of the word soul and where it came from, it's actually quite interesting because the history of the word soul, the Proto-Germanic roots of this word, it's not exactly clear and it's not 100% agreed upon, but many people believe that it comes from the idea of from the sea or from the lake. And this relates to some of the spiritual ideas of where one's nature or where this nature that animates us comes from. And there's this notion of fluidity. There's this notion of a dynamic innervating energy that comes through us and animates us and gives us our unique complexity. And this was interesting to me because of the fact that obviously it really created a nice symmetry between the deep history of the word soul and this concept of the data wake that I had been experimenting with or trying to popularize or discuss. But I think the idea of a data soul is actually far more, it crystallizes the notion and the concept in a far more effective way, not only in terms of its reflection of the concept itself, but I think also in its capacity to resonate with others and perhaps spread as a meme. And so why data soul instead of data wake? I think it's appropriate because of the fact that we need to conceptualize ourselves in a way that is evolving across time. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to get this quote wrong, but there's a quote that's something along the lines of, one does not die until the last person who remembers them dies. Or one does not die until one is no longer remembered. Something along those lines. And it's a very old idea, and that idea maps back all the way to our kind of our mythopoetic history, in the sense where we would tell stories about those who we admired and those who had accomplished great things. But then we evolved a bit, and we created writing. And when we had writing, one could both narrate their own history to some extent. So you could create artifacts of yourself, extensions of yourself, where you took your thoughts, your imaginations, your ideas, and crystallized them using words on the page. And that crystalline form of yourself could actually transcend your life. But even though it transcended your life, it was a very low resolution image or very low resolution window into who you were. For example, we have a great deal of writings from many historical figures, but do you really think that you could take those writings and fundamentally recreate a high resolution simulation of any of these people? You might argue yes, but I would probably take the opposite position. I actually think you would be making many inferences that are unlikely to be justified. You would be creating a simulation that is very likely to behave differently. While you might get some things right, you're going to get most predictions wrong. And so we can see that across time, more and more of the imprint that we make on the world is captured, is stored, is crystallized. And yet we haven't quite realized that in today's world, that's gone exponential. It's nothing like it was. Not only is it far more likely that you've written a large amount of publicly accessible structured language that can be analyzed by others, but a vast majority of your online behaviors are tracked by someone. Those are recorded, those are stored, those are aggregated. The things that you search, as we've seen many articles that demonstrate that people tap into their deepest and darkest motivations and inquiries when they're interacting in what they think is this intimate scenario with a Google search box. And it's obviously not that intimate because Google is using that to create a model and then obviously sell you ads. Now, this is happening across this entire space. And what does that imply? Well, it implies that these virtual models of ourselves are actually very much and increasingly capturing every way in which our presence and our being in the world ripples through space and time, impacting other individuals, impacting corporate entities, impacting political entities. That whole pattern, even though it was, the whole pattern that was invisible for the vast majority of history, both invisible and transient, not only could we not see it, but we could also not recover it. Now we can both see it in real time, we can recover it and encode it, and we can use it to feed back upon the system to control the people in question. And this is a fundamentally new mode of interacting with the data that is generated about us. And what I'm trying to say is that in many ways, I think this word soul, as it's been used historically, this word soul as humans have tried to, the way that humans have tried to articulate the essence of a person, what makes you you, we've created a word to try to express that. It's been obviously bound to the spiritual and the religious, and one can say what they will about the physical and material existence of that spiritual entity. But for all intents and purposes, the same concept now applies to our data footprint, because unlike any point in history, that virtual creation, that reconstruction of the self, is the closest thing we can get to this historical idea of the soul. And I say that because of the fact that if you can be predicted in a way that even you wouldn't guess you would act, that means that these models are deeply capable of representing parts of you that would surprise even yourself. And if those are not the parts of ourselves that we were speaking about when we created the word soul, I'm not really sure what parts of ourselves we were speaking about to begin with. And so I really do believe that it's imperative that we begin looking at these networked spatio-temporal structures that we create as we move through physical and digital space, and that is increasingly captured. We need to look at these as extensions of ourself that belong to us in the way that you might think that your soul belongs to you. And that is absolutely imperative in a world where that information, where that soul, where that data soul is going to be used against you if you don't take ownership of it. Now, that brings up the next question, which is how do we take ownership of it? How do we begin to move to a world where we actually can own our own souls? And this is one of the reasons why I believe the phrase data soul is so compelling, because we are truly, every moment we are interacting with an entity who's doing this to us, who's capturing this data and not providing compensation, who's not inviting us to a seat at the table, governing or with respect to the future or the usage of our own soul. Every time we do that, we are literally selling our soul, but we're selling our soul without even getting paid. So we're just giving it up. We are prostituting our souls. And that's something that we really need to take a minute, perhaps take a few days to really reflect on what it means for society at large to be in the business of soul prostitution. I don't think it leads to a place filled with the types of creative, self-sovereign, and free individuals that I would like to see. I think it leads to a place of tyranny. I think it leads to a place in which the individual human spirit is subjugated to the base, low-resolution economic desires of those who can do the best job of capturing your soul for the lowest cost. And to me, I think that's an absolute tragedy. So that's it for today.